What I'm going to do with this video is just pause it after each segment and lay everything out. All the problems I have with each segment, so I'm not pausing every 5 to 10 seconds. So here we go.
Following God's law. God's law is summarized in the 10 Commandments, which are all either about loving God or loving your neighbor. The first commandment says to worship God and have no other gods before God. So obviously unbelief is a sin because you can't worship God if you don't believe in him. Existential fear is also a sin because it means you're not trusting God, which is a form of not worshiping God because faith means trust. But we need to clarify that this is existential fear we're talking about. Obviously, if a bear is chasing you, there's a good kind of fear that can help preserve you. But if you're worried about how your life is going to go, that means you're not trusting God's plan for you. That's why Jesus says not to worry about your life, because God cares about you. Also, if we're only supposed to worship God, then self-worship is a sin, which covers a lot of other things like pride, selfishness, and narcissism. The reason we're not supposed to worship ourselves is because we are sinners, but God is perfect. The second commandment says to not...
So, sin has nothing to do with criminal activity then? Only with being without God? How is sin bad then? Why does a powerful being need laws? How are these laws even sensible? God hasn't committed any violations by creating Adam and Eve without their consent, or designing birth as non-contractive or consensual, along with hell? Why do you Christians approve of God's laws and agree with the eternal consequence that hell is? As for sin, it can't be if Adam and Eve were both God's creation and live in God's land, which makes it holy. Both being his creation and being in God's presence, God also set them up with that tree, which would be divine foul play, would it not? Free will is the common argument against this, and that's illogical because they're both God's creation, which means nothing could change their created nature. Aside from that, neither of them could choose evil, and God couldn't give them evil options because God is only capable of good, right? Which also means this tree can't contain evil either. As for God, in this context, if my assumption is right, how can mortal man hurt God? If my understanding is wrong, why does God need mortal love, and how is not loving God criminal? What if one's neighbor is an asshole? Love them anyway? How does that solve problems? Maybe this is wrong on God's part. Worship is the key word here. How is God good and loving by expecting mortal worship? Why do you want to worship this God, and why do you believe God deserves to be worshipped? How is worship, feeding the ego, which is a mental disorder, good? And why do you want to worship this God? Why do you feel God deserves worship? Unbelief. How is not worshiping God criminal, harmful to people? Obviously it's offensive to God, but that only means, again, that God is psychotic, which is not perfection. He's good? Okay, how does that make God good? Fear. How is God trustworthy? After all, he made us mortal and vulnerable, both to each other and to the planet, which many of you Christians argue that he, quote, made perfectly for us. That's our fault? Okay, 1. That removes God from the equation then. 2. God still set Adam and Eve up and made us this way, upon banishing those two. Or why didn't they at least get a second chance? What makes you think this Bible is honest? Why is trust even a part of the equation? How is our existence good and safe? And how is God trustworthy by making us this way? God also banished Adam and Eve without trial. How is that trustworthy? Just the idea that we were forced into this existence and to be tested are two big strikes against God's character. Free will is one of the main cop-outs from you Christians. So why isn't either birth or this testing both included in the free will package? As for the fear of a bear, could we be harmed by anything if God made us invincible? God put us into such a dangerous scenario, being the planet, so how does that play into the trust thing? 2. Isn't the idea of this religion to get into heaven, which would require death? Worry. Would this be a part of the human experience if God made us immortal and without needs? God having a plan would eliminate the need for any kind of fear or worry, wouldn't it? How is God's plan good if it involves danger? And why do you agree or approve of this plan? This is a common issue with religious thinking. All of you neglect to consider that none of these existential negatives would exist if God was a responsible creator and wouldn't be. God is powerful, remember? Worship is a psychosis, to want to be, and to do so of others. Pride and selfishness aren't bad states of mind as long as neither are taken too far. However, narcissism is a mental disorder. God is the one who has these issues, which makes him a sinner by this logic. Define perfect, and how is God such? Disorderly selfishness doesn't call for worship. Additional comments about this segment. Okay, God caring about us. Well, putting us through this mortal shell of existence, which you people would call your usual scapegoats of Adam and Eve to argue that this existence is our fault, which makes you trying to have the cake and eat it too by claiming this life is a test, but then say this life is our fault, is to not care about us. To endanger us for his own purpose, to test us, is not only careless, the height of irresponsibility, but psychotic. He isn't caring for us if he's testing us against our will. He's using us, but you would excuse that also. So why do you want to be used, and how is that good? Now, you could say that you want him to use us, but you're trying to claim here that God cares for us. Any attempt to change the goalpost by saying you permit him to use you, well, all of us, as you're arrogant enough to try speaking for us atheists, will be shut down. Isn't God selfish? No? What is he then? He may not worship himself, but he expects to be worshipped, to the extent that he created hell to punish those who don't forever. This might be even worse. Self-worship or using people for personal gain.
Make any idols or false gods. Of course, this means don't literally make a golden calf and worship it, but idolatry extends to more than just that, because not all idols are made with human hands. Many of them are made inside our hearts. For example, if we love money, social status, and sex to the point where we get our meaning in life from those things, that's idolatry too. It's not bad to want those things in general, but as the Christian pastor Tim Keller said, idolatry is turning good things into ultimate things. Another form of idolatry is worshiping God in the wrong way. It would still be wrong to worship a golden calf even if we said we were worshiping God through it, because God decides how he wants to be worshipped. We don't get to worship God however we want. Also, since the second commandment says to not worship any graven image, many Christians think we're not supposed to make any images of God at all because we might be tempted to worship them. The third commandment is to not misuse God's name, because doing so is blasphemy. The reason blasphemy is so bad is because God's name is holy and must be seen as worthy of respect. That's why it's wrong to use God's name as a curse word or a cap.
Oops. Anyway. How is getting your meaning from life from God any better than getting it from money, sex, or social status? God gets his meaning from worship, obedience, and so on. The problem here is life's meaning is about God and not us, which is far worse than orienting one's life around sex, money, or status. God expects absolute self-denial. How about making us in his image? Wouldn't that be self-idolatry? Does God also expect human service in heaven? No? Then why does God expect it in this life? Why do you want to worship God, period? Especially when God is so excessively petty that even worship of him through something offends him. That's just psychotic. Now for part 3 here.
Casual expression, because it's not in a sacred and holy manner. However, it's also wrong to make jokes about God, and here's why. According to any culture, the one thing you're not allowed to joke about is that which is sacred. According to our culture, one of the worst things is to make a racist or sexist joke. The reason our culture is so sensitive about that is our culture sees equality as something sacred, which is why you're not allowed to joke about anything that offends that. So, if we see God's name as sacred, we shouldn't joke about God's name either, because in any given culture, you cannot joke about things that are sacred. There's several other ways to misuse God's name. Doing evil in God's name is one of the worst sins because it causes the name of God to be associated with evil rather than good. It's also a big sin to use God for selfish gain, like a lot of those prosperity gospel preachers whose churches are just a big money scam. And I personally think stupidity in God's name, like using the Bible to defend silly things like a flat earth conspiracy theory, is also a form of blasphemy because it causes Christianity to be associated with stupid things. The fourth commandment is to remember the...
So how is God holy or sacred? Doesn't sound like God has any self-respect. You Christians certainly don't, as you insist on catering to this motherfucker. If even jokes aren't allowed, then that would be the maximum level of insecurity. That's narcissism. God is the pure embodiment of everything he despises and forbids us of. How are jokes harmful? At what point do you Christians consider God to be harmful? Never? Why not? Because he's God? How does his own being exempt him from guilt? Do you enjoy pain and suffering? Sensitivity is the key word here. Being offended by bad-natured jokes means insecurity because racism and sexism are social ills. And such people are either indoctrinated or mentally ill, and that needs to be dealt with. God is the psycho if he's offended by anything, as he punishes instead of solving a problem or dealing with a person with civility. Punishing people doesn't solve anything. The mentality still exists. Equality isn't something to be regarded as either holy or sacred. Equality is just how something should naturally be. This aspect is nonsense. I don't think any jokes can even be made about equality, but to oppose equality is to be mentally ill. Evil. So, God never did anything evil, according to the Bible? I would ask if God is altruistic, but every Christian would just say, Jesus' sacrifice was, because, quote, God gave his only begotten Son. This is invalid because God did that for his own gain, to not only revert the blame of sin from him to Adam and Eve, but to ultimately gain human submission and obedience through that sacrifice, which would be this, quote, evil Christianity always talks about. I guess preaching, arguing, and hell threats would all be forms of blasphemy too then, because those cause resistance, which those Christians would call hating God or demonic, essentially aggravating that demon or devil those Christians claim to be inside us.
Sabbath, and the Sabbath is one day out of every 7 days that is set apart and dedicated to the Lord. The most basic way to observe the Sabbath is to go to church on Sunday, so skipping church without a good excuse is a violation of the fourth commandment. We're also told to rest on the Sabbath, and interestingly, laziness is a version of breaking the command to rest. How does that make any sense? Well, a wise person once said, no one is ever really too busy. If they care, they will make time. So if we care about making time for God and resting on Sunday, we will get our work done on all the other days of the week. The fifth...
So, would any kind of work be required in heaven? If not, then why is work a necessity in this existence? Or why do you want to go to heaven if heaven involves work? Would any of this be even necessary if we weren't born? Or if God didn't create life?
The fifth commandment is to honor and respect your parents. Bro, what if my parents have problems? Doesn't matter, everyone's a sinner, you still have to respect them. Because God has ordained earthly authorities, such as parents and the government, and therefore it's a sin to disobey either of those things. Yes, both of these authorities are imperfect in many ways and often sin themselves, but God knows that without them society would collapse. So God ordains these authorities in order to restrain human evil. The sixth...
Parents being shit falls under my what if God created us perfectly question. How is God a superior authority to either parents or governments? How is authority even a good thing? And why do you want any authority? We are inherently bad? Remember that divine authority resulted in that inheritance. Besides, how can heaven be sustainable if we're all sinners? Would sin have happened if God didn't create any life?